When civilization becomes a trap, escape is your only chance. Out of the city and into the wilderness. That's the philosophy of survival preppers. They plan routes, set up camps, build traps. Preparations are underway. After all, something could happen at any time. Crises, wars, disasters, or the end of the world. The equipment is ready. The cellars are well stocked with supplies. And survival seminars are booming. Whether out of genuine concern or just for the thrill, more and more people are switching to crisis mode. Essen, a city in Germany's Ruhr area. 51-year-old Andreas Bagel is setting out on his weekend routine. With his backpack and his dog Loki, he leaves the city on foot. He wants to practice his escape route in case of an emergency. Loki is carrying emergency equipment too. For Andreas Bagel, an emergency means the collapse of civilization and widespread chaos, triggered by crisis, catastrophe, or war.
I don't think I'm an oddball. Actually, I'm pretty standard. A pamphlet put out by the Office of Technology Assessment says that after 2 or 3 days, the assumption is that public order can no longer be maintained. They assume that the entire society will revert to archaic small-scale groupings, at least temporarily.
Andreas Bagel is what is known as a prepper, someone who is prepared. His march out of the city is like a dry run for disaster.
A safe haven means out of the city for me. That gives me a sense of relief. The fewer people there are, the better it is. It has to be a place that's out of sight, that's known to as few people as possible, where I have access to the resources I need.
Be prepared. For many, this old Boy Scout motto has become a way of life, always waiting for the worst-case scenario, in hopes that it will never come.
I'm not a pessimist at all. I'm an optimist. I'm someone who doesn't like to be caught by surprise by something like that. I look at it like my insurance policy. I don't want to fall victim to circumstances and later on say I knew it, I should have been prepared, but now I haven't done anything. Great. They say it's better to have than to need. And if you have a bit of a soft spot for nature and want to get back to nature more, then it's easy to prepare for a crisis.
Andreas Bagel is not alone. Thousands of Germans share his concerns. And while so-called preppers used to be ridiculed, today, prepping strategies are taken more and more seriously. The world is in crisis mode. Natural disasters, pandemics, cyber attacks, and a war in Europe. The threats are drawing closer. One emergency scenario is a widespread power outage over an extended period of time. Winter 2005 in the Münster area. Ice and snow triggered a catastrophe. 250,000 people had no electricity for 4 days. It was still possible to reach them with supplies at the time. But a sustained blackout always poses a risk to the security situation. If parts of the critical infrastructure fail, public order in the cities will collapse too. That's the prepper's vision. So far, most riots and street battles have been politically motivated, but that could change. Disaster control authorities factor panic, looting, and unrest into their catastrophe scenarios.
Threat scenarios are always evolving, of course, depending on how things develop. After 2000, we had threat scenarios that were mostly based on natural disasters. Then, as technology developed, cybercrime and threats to critical infrastructure are a huge issue too. In other words, how can critical infrastructure be protected? What threat scenarios are we facing, whether it's terrorist or other criminal acts? Now, added to these are the very latest armed conflicts that we didn't even have in our portfolio.
When the state starts to falter, preppers take matters into their own hands. The goal is to survive for a longer period of time without outside help.
After 72 hours have passed, lots of things won't work anymore, maybe even sooner. Phones, for example. I need electricity for phones. Computer batteries will run out of energy. And since most people no longer have radios with batteries, they'll be cut off from information. Mobile phones can't be charged without the power grid. So after 72 hours, quite a lot of the things we actually need to survive will break down.
This is the moment that Andreas Bagel is preparing for. When crisis strikes, the countdown to his escape begins.
There's a widespread belief, but it varies depending on the prepper, that if a major crisis strikes, the institutions, the authorities and the police will be overwhelmed to the point where officials themselves will be fighting for their lives, and they won't be able to perform their duties. Society will be overwhelmed, and officials will no longer be able to take care of society on a large scale. And that's when, as they say, you have to help yourself.
The beautiful side of the end of the world. Bagel relocates to the countryside, out of the city and into the forest. Survival training is also a way to experience nature.
I know how hard it is to stay outside for more than one day. It's not easy. You can do it well if you know what you're doing, but it takes experience. And that's why I often spend time outdoors to practice it. And every time you sleep outside, you get a little more confident and a little better at it.
The 51-year-old now works only part-time. He took survival courses in his late 30s, and survival strategies have been his passion ever since.
The phenomenon of survivalism is older. In fact, it's from the 19th century. And it involves techniques for surviving in the wilderness, mixed with people's enthusiasm for outdoor sports, camping, hunting, or things like that.
The main thing you need to survive in the wild is shelter, and food, of course. Building traps is just for practice. No wild game should be killed. In Germany, the privilege is reserved for hunters only.
We need a small tree for this, like this one, for instance, which is still very flexible. Then we need a so-called L7 trigger, which means this part goes into the ground. I'll hammer it in here in a second. And then this part goes into the 7 at the top here. This, in turn, is attached to this small tree, which is under tension. And then we attach a sling to it. And the animal runs through here and pulls the sling closed. The whole thing is unhooked and the tree pulls the animal upward.
The L goes into the 7. If the trap snaps shut, then maybe there'll be a rabbit dangling there.
There are two basic types of preppers. One is the bug-out prepper, who says you have to get out of the city away from civilization. You have to adapt. You have to adjust to the circumstances around you. Most importantly, you have to develop skills, abilities you can use to survive. And then there are the bug-in preppers, who mainly plan to bunker down at home, who often do this at a very high technical level, supplying themselves with heat and water, with a generator, for instance, or a water filtration system.
Watch your head. You're a little taller than me.
Philip Jakubowski is a bug-in prepper. His home is his survival space. He stores several weeks' worth of food in his cellar, including a whole shelf full of alcohol.
Alcohol is a currency for me. In a crisis, I can use it to barter for other things I've run out of. Alcohol always works in a crisis. It's like a means of payment. And that's why I have this stock of alcohol.
If you want to ride out a crisis, you need food with a long shelf life.
I keep my canned food quick and easy. It can be eaten cold, too. And look at this plastic box. We're in the basement here, and it's relatively damp, so things like flour or pasta that are wrapped in paper and plastic would quickly go moldy. They take on moisture. So I have my box here with everything in it that could get damp. There's a sensor, and I have dehumidifier pads in there as well.
The cats are playing upstairs in the apartment. Philip Jakubowski stores pet food in his basement as well. It could also serve as a last resort for him in an emergency.
When push comes to shove, and everyone crosses that threshold at a different point, but most people would eat pet food if need be. You just have to be hungry enough.
What goes in must come out. So, the equipment also includes an emergency toilet.
It's actually a bucket with a toilet seat. You put a bag in it, and you can also build it yourself from a bucket and a swimming noodle. I have lots of pet litter from the pet store. You can sprinkle that on top to make it a little more hygienic.
For Philip Jakubowski, emergency planning is part of his everyday family life. With crises lurking at every turn, it's a project that never ends.
The more I think about it, the more I notice new dangers that I have to be prepared to meet. And that means I have to keep stepping up my precautionary game. There's a whole prepper industry that's all about prepping, selling packages of provisions and the like.
Andreas Bagel trains in a private forest. He has permission to make a fire and spend the night there. Survivalists use what nature has to offer. The bark of the birch tree contains essential oils, and that makes it useful for starting fires.
Now we're going to start a fire.
A fire provides warmth and a way to prepare food. The first challenge in any weather is to find dry wood.
So I'm collecting firewood. We have to go from small to big. The thinner the better. This looks good here. Of course, the most important thing is that the wood should be dead, so it's dry. And it's even better if it's upright. The water drains off really well, making it really dry despite the rain that's left. I mean, the ground's soaking wet. This here is dry kindling, which is exactly what we need. It's just beautiful outside. 20 years ago, I couldn't tell you the difference between a fir and a spruce. At some point I said to myself, it's kind of sad that you don't know that anymore.
Andreas Bagel now spends most of his spare time in the forest. Being in nature has become his second daily routine. He's constantly perfecting his survival techniques.
Nowadays, I really love being outdoors. Going outside and trying out new things. Crisis preparation. It's my ambition to optimize things so you have as much multi-use as possible with as few things as possible and can improvise too.
The super rich are also getting ready for the apocalypse. Billionaire preppers have bunkers to suit their wallets. The promotional video of a Swiss bunker builder shows ways to make survival in the wake of final disaster pleasant. For the ultimate luxury bug-in, take the limousine or helicopter to your underground fortress. Along with a spacious garage for your car collection, the provider offers an underground world of amenities. The logic? If you can afford a multi-million-dollar property above ground, you won't skimp on a nuclear-proof basement either. If the manufacturers are to be believed, giant bunkers like this already exist all over the world, with a bar and private art gallery included. The locations of these underground shelters are kept secret for a good reason. Visitors aren't welcome in a crisis. In Fürstenfeldbruck near Munich, Peter Auenhammer offers a more down-to-earth shelter. His bunkers are pragmatically tailored to various disaster scenarios. The contractor's order books are full.
The conflict in Ukraine is driving up demand for shelters. People are afraid of armed conflicts because of the risk of a nuclear attack from abroad with radiation exposure that can affect us indirectly through the radioactive fallout that might settle here. People want to protect themselves and their families from radiation.
The company offers affordable, functionally equipped systems built with prefabricated modules. An existing basement can be upgraded to a bunker, for instance, or the shelter can be incorporated into plans for new construction.
Here we see our armored door that seals off the shelter. Right now, it's still a shell without concrete. The door will be inserted into the concrete, and once the wall's been concreted, the door panel will be cast. That means we have a reinforced concrete door 20 centimeters thick for a certain level of protection against radiation and shock waves. We have two closures here, one in the reinforced concrete and a surround seal to make the space airtight. To force the door open if it's blocked, maybe the building's buried in rubble, we have a way to do that. You attach this square tube to the lock. Open the armored door, and this threaded rod can then be attached, and the door can be forced open. We have a long lever with the key here, so we can use the threaded rod to force the door open. With a weight of up to 8 metric tons, we can move heavy objects that might be in front of the armored door, so people can escape out of the shelter door.
Aus der Schutzraumtür rauskommen.
In the luxury bunker, huge air filters create a pleasant atmosphere. Oxygen storage and self-contained energy generation promise independence at the end of the civilized world. The dimensions of the facilities could even supply an entire hospital. Peter Auenhammer's shelters are more realistic. The technology is simple, effective, and always ready to use.
Here we see the ventilation system for our ABC shelter. It has an activated carbon filter that filters out up to 99% of all known chemical warfare agents from the ambient air. If there is no electricity available, the system can operate with a hand crank. The crank is attached and the fan is operated by hand.
Und kann den Ventilator per Hand betreiben.
How long people stay in the shelter depends on the threat situation. You'll receive information via radio or television in the event of a nuclear attack, for example. It is advisable to stay in the shelter for as long as possible. Nuclear radiation dissipates very, very steeply in the first few days. There are projections from Switzerland that show that the radiation dose drops to just 1% in the first 7 days, and is only 0.01% within 14 days of the event.
0,01% vorhanden ist.
The entrepreneur sells models for different needs: basic, classic, premium. When building a new house, you'd have to invest around 40 to 50,000 euros. But when it comes to price and equipment, Auenhammer also offers upward flexibility. Retreating in style if things get really tough. That's the promise of first-class bunkers. Luxury providers promise their paying customers a comfortable stay underground, even if the world outside is coming to an end. In the face of apocalypse, 5-star furnishings and fittings might offer some comfort. And if you don't want to build a bunker of your own, you can rent space in a luxury facility, even for several years. Where does the prepper's fear come from? The old worry of the nuclear abyss is back. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, repeatedly threatening to deploy its nuclear arsenal. As war rages in Eastern Europe, many feel transported back to the 1980s, to the height of the Cold War between East and West. At the time, escalation in the conflict could have caused a nuclear battlefield, with a divided Germany caught in the middle. The population on both sides of the Iron Curtain was supposed to survive the impending nuclear apocalypse in bunkers, or at least a small portion of them. Like here in Berlin, radiation-proof underground mass shelters were built throughout the country, and bomb shelters from the Second World War were updated into nuclear shelters. There were more than 2,000 state-run shelters like this spread across the country. Dietmar Arnold from Berliner Unterwelten is working to preserve some of these Cold War relics.
The interesting thing is, if we take a look at the mirror here, it's not mirror glass, it's polished metal. And here's why. With glass, if someone goes crazy down here, they might smash the mirror and then attack themselves and others with the shards. And the goal was to prevent that, hence these polished metal mirrors.
During construction, they drew on the wealth of experience from past bombardments.
If we look at a toilet cubicle like this, you can see there are no doors, only curtains. That's based on experience from the Second World War. Back then, the bunker toilet with wooden doors was the only place you could retreat to in private. And when the fight for Berlin was raging, and people were sitting in the bunkers, the people who couldn't take it anymore retreated to the cubicles and tried to kill themselves. Many of them succeeded. In any event, witnesses described that the toilets in the bunkers were full of dead people at the end of the war, so to keep people from sitting in the toilet for too long and not coming out, so they could be checked on, they put curtains here.
When the Cold War ended and led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, these facilities suddenly became superfluous. The nuclear threat seemed to have vanished. The bunkers had outlived their purpose. Many of them were sold, and most were dismantled. Some were turned into museums. None of the facilities are operational anymore.
They thought of ways to cut the costs that they were producing every year by having to maintain these shelters, doing repair work on them and even rebuilding them. And then in 1997, they actually decided to stop building bunkers, and then in 2007, they finally decided to completely dismantle them and quit operating them altogether.
But Russia's invasion of Ukraine completely altered the global situation. The old fears have returned.
They just completed an inventory, and now we're considering whether to push ahead the shelter construction again. But if we take the 600 structures we have right now, they can usually accommodate around 3,000 people each. So there'd be room for around 1.8 million people at the moment, with a population of about 84 million people in Germany.
Eyingen in the south of Germany. Hidden beneath this overgrown garden is another relic of the Cold War. A few ventilation pipes are the only visible witnesses of a forgotten era. Michael Grimm took over a private shelter from the 1980s that was installed by his father.
My father was an optimistic pessimist, I'd say. He reckoned with everything that could and can happen. The bunker is due to a traumatic experience, or several traumatic experiences that my father had in the Second World War. That's what triggered the bunker construction. My father experienced the bombing of Dresden and saw a lot of horrific things. And then there was the Cold War. He was always preoccupied by these things back then. He couldn't get over it and wanted to create a safe space for his family. And that's the bunker that's here now. But it wasn't built until 1985 because he didn't have the money till then. It's that simple. He planned it himself, very precisely. All of it, down to the last detail.
An island of concrete, hidden beneath his private home. In the 1980s, Michael Grimm's father was ridiculed at first, but then came the first nuclear disaster.
What was interesting, of course, was when Chernobyl blew up shortly after the bunker was built. And all the people who had laughed at him came to ask, hey, if it gets bad, can we put our children in there? Or something like that. That was gratifying.
Die ist voll funktionsfähig.
It is fully
Und
operational.
zwar wird Luft
Here's the
angesaugt,
air intake.
einmal
At first,
ohne Filter, direkt
without a
von
filter,
draußen,
directly from outside,
vom Garten raus.
through the garden shed.
Und das läuft über
And
einen,
then it runs through a special filter.
der ist mit einem speziellen, ja,
I think it's called bright.
ich glaube, das ist Schwerspat, nennt man das.
It binds atomic
Das
particles.
bindet dann atomare Teilchen.
That means I can then switch
Ich kann
over.
dann umschalten hier oben,
Up here.
wenn es warm ist.
When it's warm, I can switch it over.
Umschalten,
Fresh air
Luft
and
und
filtered air.
gefilterte Luft. Ja, und hier hat
And this thing here tells us that you're in the safe zone.
im grünen Bereich dann ist.
The complete bug-in bunkering down is back as a way to survive a conflict between East and West.
Das ist absolut aktuell.
It's up to date.
Und,
And we've asked ourselves whether we can get it up and running again.
und ich schätze, dass
I imagine if you did everything right, it would take 2 days of work and then everything would be okay again.
alles wieder okay.
But Michael Grimm does not want to go underground himself.
Ich bin jetzt 68.
I'm 68 now.
Will ich da noch rein?
Why would I want to go in there?
Nee.
No, absolutely not.
He would no longer fight to survive after a disaster. Those who bunker down must also have hopes of emerging back into a world that is still worth living in. For Grimm, this is a prospect he'd rather recommend to his children and grandchildren. Bunkers have a calming effect on the younger generations too. The purpose of a private bunker like this one is actually never to be used.
The question is what happens afterwards, especially if we're talking about serious scenarios such as a nuclear attack. Protective structures will ultimately be nothing more than a life-prolonging measure.
Even if public shelters still existed, there would only be enough room for a fraction of the population. This is not an option for survival prepper Andreas Bagel. His survival plan, the bug out, is to escape and to have a system of backpacks always packed and ready to go.
Basically, there are 3 types of backpacks. One is a so-called get-home bag. In this size here. It's something I have with me when I'm traveling by car. It's got everything I need to get back home at any time. Poncho, a first aid kit, a water bottle where I can purify a little water if I need to. Then we have a bug-out bag. That would be something more like this. Bug-out means I leave my home for a foreseeable period of time and then go back again. And the third would be the so-called inch backpack, which means I never come home. That would be a backpack I leave home with and never come back. But I don't have that either. So actually you'd have to pimp the bug-out bag a little more.
It's a doomsday scenario. I'll never come home. No return to civilization. But Bagel doesn't want to plan that far just yet. He's still an optimist and wants to return to everyday life with his dog Loki.
Now we have something else on the side. This is not made for humans, it's for the dog. This is the dog's escape backpack. It just has a week's worth of dog food, and here are some bandages in case he steps on something. The dog has to carry his own things. I don't want to have to do that too. So everyone in the family should have a backpack with the most important things. I'd take along a big saw. This is what it looks like.
This is an emergency bandage, a prefabricated compression bandage. This is something used in first aid to seal off a potentially fatal injury, a heavily bleeding wound, for example. Tödliche Verletzung, also eine stark arteriell blutende Wunde, abzusperren. Arbeitshandschuhe finde ich extrem
Work gloves are extremely important to keep from getting splinters. Our hands are our most important outdoor tool, and they need to be protected.
Und die müssen entsprechend geschützt werden.
The backpack was developed by the US military as emergency equipment for pilots. 72 hours, 3 days. That's the time span that has to be bridged. Every prepper decides for themselves how deeply they want to immerse themselves in this parallel world.
How much do you want it to determine your life and how much do you want to invest in it? You have to look at what you think is possible and what's not and prepare accordingly. But one thing we see is that many people start small and keep going from there.
Some emergency strategies can become a reasonable part of everyday life. In Germany, the Federal Office of Civil Protection and Disaster Assistance oversees crisis preparedness. The highest German emergency authority has issued a guide recommending what German citizens should do to prepare. Supplies for 3 days and at least 2 liters of water per person per day are recommended. An emergency backpack with medication and copies of personal documents should also be at the ready. This is not prepper madness, but the recommended standard.
The state can't help all households during a 72-hour power outage, for example. That's why the first line of defense is that the population is prepared in some way, making sure they have certain foods available over a longer period of time that don't require electricity to cook, where you won't necessarily need a microwave. You want to have flashlights at home, with enough batteries on hand, and maybe also a battery-operated radio to get information.
Early morning, a forest near the city of Münster. Morning fog is covering the treetops. Andreas Bagel meets a group of survivalists. They are course participants who want to practice what to do in case of an emergency. Andreas Bagel has been teaching survival courses for more than 10 years. He now runs his own company.
In survival, there are 4 cornerstones that have to be addressed: protection, food, location, and water.
Prepping is in.
If I don't have one of the 4, then I have to think about whether I should stay put or move to ensure my survival. That means leaving the place, leaving my home, which means losing my protection, and then I have a real problem because then everything else is gone too.
Blackout. Preparing for disaster. Finding your way in the forest. A touch of a horror show is a must. After all, course participants have booked a little adventure.
The rule of 3 means a lot of things. What will kill me? 3 seconds of panic. Then we have 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 hours in the cold. We have perfect weather right now. Not just for a blackout because there's no wind and no sun, but perfect weather for dying outside as well. Most people who die from hypothermia die when the temperature is between 0 and 10 degrees Celsius. They die 3 to 6 hours after the situation occurs, as studies in England have found. Then we have 3 days without water, but that only applies to adults. If I have small children, it gets very critical after 1 day. Then we have 3 weeks without food. But that doesn't mean I walk around for 3 weeks and then drop dead. I probably won't move at all during the last few days. My body will still be alive and sitting around somewhere waiting for the end. 3 months without social contact, and 3 years without professional medical care, without medical assistance.
According to the course description, it takes just 2.5 hours for anyone to learn how to use a compass and a map. But this requires basic knowledge of math.
Bitte alle einmal gucken. Könnt ihr mich sehen?
Okay, everyone, please take a look. This is important.
Der eigentliche Witz am Kompass
The real joke
ist,
about the
dass es ein
compass
Dunkelmesser ist.
is that it's a
Ich
protractor.
habe 3 Punkte.
I have 3 points.
Ich habe meinen Standpunkt,
One point is fixed.
den weiß ich auch.
I know that on the map. We've just found it here on the curve.
Und ich
And then
habe
I have the
einen
magnetic
magnetischen
North Pole, which is also fixed. I can't change it.
verändern. Da
And the
zeigt der
third
Kompass.
point I need in order to measure the
Der
angle
Punkt, den ich
is
brauche,
my
um links zu
destination.
messen, ist eben mein Ziel.
It quickly becomes clear that anyone who struggled with a protractor in school will probably lose their way during the apocalypse.
Jeder misst,
Everyone measures with different levels of accuracy,
ja?
so everyone sees things a little differently.
Jeder guckt
You
auch,
might end up a few meters apart as a
ein paar
result.
Meter auseinanderläuft. Ganz kurz zur Erläuterung.
Scaring his rookie survivalists just a little bit is part of the business for the trainer.
Gehe ich hinter den Baum. Wir haben ja jetzt nur mal das Thema,
At the moment, we have the war in
wenn
Ukraine.
das weiter
If it escalates and we end up in a war between NATO and Russia,
NATO gegen
the first thing to go is the GPS, our GPS
Weg sein
reception.
wird, ist das GPS-Gerät. Also unser GPS-Empfang.
So you won't be able to navigate anymore. Either the Russians will shoot it down, or the Americans will
Oder,
encrypt
wenn die
it.
es nicht schaffen, das abzuschießen, werden die Amerikaner das verschlüsseln. Sollte es irgendwo eine
If a
Atombombe,
nuclear bomb strikes somewhere, that's truly horrific.
der muss noch nicht mal auf der Erde
It doesn't even have to happen on the ground. People talk about detonating nuclear bombs in the atmosphere.
dass die Atombombe in der Ionosphäre gezündet wird.
We'd have next to zero radioactive fallout here,
Fallout
so you can ignore that.
kann man ignorieren.
But the problem will be the electromagnetic
Der
pulse.
elektromagnetische Impuls. EMP.
Depending on how big the bomb is, over large parts of Northern Europe, all electronic devices will be destroyed, including GPS devices, mobile phones, and so on.
Unter Umständen Autos, Handys und.
Unlike for avid preppers, this is an adventure playground for adults.
Auch so Feuerhaus.
Aspiring survivalists will take home some newly acquired skills. Not everything they learn here will actually help them in the big city. But after crossing a precipice, hanging on a rope, one returns to city life with a little more self-confidence, along with a few tips that can come in handy in the event of an emergency.
Es ist allen zu empfehlen, dass sie zumindest sich
They advise that you at least prepare yourself for a situation like
was kann
this.
ich eigentlich tun?
In other words, think about what you can do if some kind of natural disaster occurs.
Auseinandersetzung einen selber betreffen
In
sollte,
times of
dann
war,
sollte man
you should at least have prepared enough to get by for a few days.
Ja,
Or you might even have to leave home and relocate to another
sein Haus
place.
verlassen muss oder auch die Örtlichkeit, wo man eigentlich wohnt.
One could say, prepping is healthy and boosts self-confidence.
Man weiß, man kann sich immer helfen.
It's good to know that you can always help yourself. Most importantly, you prepare not just for a big disaster, but to help yourself during smaller emergencies at home. But it also provides a sense of uniqueness.
Bedürfnis nach Einzigartigkeit.
Life hacks, everyday tricks, tell you how to use objects in ways other than for their intended purposes. This is what survival is about. After all, creativity in the little things might make the difference in the end.
Tampons.
Tampons,
Super
great survival tool.
Kann ich
I can use them to filter water.
Kann ich als
I can use them as
Wundauflage
wound
benutzen, weil
dressing
der
because
steril
they're in
verpackt,
sterile packaging.
ne? Einfach aufmachen,
Just open it up, put it on,
legen,
done.
fertig.
I can make a fire with them. Use them to start a fire.
Gleich mal machen, als
They
Feuerstarter.
only burn for a relatively short time, but they catch fire immediately.
Ich kann Brillen putzen.
I can use wipes for cleaning glasses.
Also wenn Sie das
They're soaked in
Entflammungszeichen
alcohol,
drauf haben,
so if they have the flammable symbol on the back, I can use them to start a fire.
von der Distel, der
The head of a thistle is brown and bushy.
so braun und so
It only
buschig.
flares up briefly, but that might be enough to get my fire going.
Aber unter Umständen reicht das schon, dass ich meinen Feuerangang kriege.
Andreas Bagel has a license to make fires in the private forest. He needs it because lighting fires is the supreme discipline of adventure training. After gathering the necessary scraps, the kindling is ignited using fire steel, a particularly high carbon metal. When rubbed, the small splinters burn at up to 1,500 degrees Celsius, giving hobby preppers a sense of accomplishment.
Hey, good job.
This calms the soul of city dwellers in uncertain times. And that's necessary because people are growing more nervous.
I think it's mostly a subjective feeling, the feeling that we're living in uncertain times. There's more change, and change happens faster, and that contributes to this. We've been through multiple crises recently, and that plays into it. There's just an individual sense of insecurity, and that doesn't always have to match up with the objective level of security.
Fear and worry are changing society, whether they're justified or not.
Wir haben auch wissenschaftliche Untersuchungen.
There are scientific surveys about how great people's fears of a conflict in Germany are. And you have to realize that 2/3 of the population are afraid that the Federal Republic of Germany will eventually be drawn into the conflict. And you can see that due to this perception of crises, not just armed conflicts, but disasters too, the population wants to be better informed and better prepared.
Crisis management as a defense against fear. An effective prescription.
It gives you a sense of security. And as a hobby, it's also something that's meaningful and fun for people. At the same time, there's also the feeling that most of society is naive, while we're realistic.
The community of preppers is growing, and it's obviously fun too. Only part of what Andreas Bagel offers here in the forest involves genuine preparation for a disaster. At the same time, there's the added bonus of a self-help group. Survival has something grounding about it, in the full sense of the word. Tying knots brings people together, and making a fire warms the heart. Survival training with a whiff of doomsday fear is one thing above all, an exciting lesson in nature studies.
How do I get water? What are reliable signs of finding potable water? Mosquitoes, for instance. Mosquitoes usually don't stray more than 50 meters away from their home waters. Reeds should also be a clear sign, right? If I see water lilies, I'm probably already standing in water. And alder trees are always in groundwater, which means I don't have to dig for long, I can get to water. Does everyone know what an alder looks like?
Questions that can be built on during the next advanced class. Most participants will be back. The registration lists are full. Until next time, the trainer advises his students to train on a regular basis in their spare time, identifying trees, getting their bearings with a compass, hiking. The course concludes with a little celebration around a homemade campfire before course members head back into the urban jungle, bolstered by the knowledge that they are now prepared for the end of the world. At least a little bit.